Hi, everybody. I'm here with Scott Wood, who's an incumbent school committee candidate looking to run for re-election. Welcome to the program, Scott.
Thank you, Frank.
You know, the fact is you have been a counselor for 2 terms. You're running for your 3rd term?
Correct.
So you've been a school committeeman for 8 years.
Yes, I have.
In total. Can you give us an interesting observation from your standpoint? When you first became a school committeeman 8 years ago, how things have changed for you as a school committeeman then, and what issues you're confronting now that maybe you didn't think you'd have to deal with back then?
Well, 8 years ago when I first started was about the start of probably the 2nd or 3rd year into the real cuts that started affecting the school system. So for my first roughly 6 years, we faced cutbacks at the state level, minimum funding from the city in most years, and having to make some tough decisions and cutting back our staff. However, and in programs as well. However, over the past year, we've actually started to rebuild the Haverhill Public Schools and add back. This was the first year, this last budget that we did, first year that we didn't have one layoff due to budgetary reasons, and we were actually able to add back to the budget. We cut user fees by half. We reduced class sizes. We restored the band program fully. So this year we've actually started to turn the corner and be able to put back some of the things that have been gone over the years.
What would you figure the percentage is of the budget that the city of Haverhill spends going for education? I know it's mostly for the school system, larger percentage, more than half, say about 55, 60%?
Yeah, it's over 50%, probably closer to 60%.
And that's the case with the other 350 cities and towns, so Haverhill is not alone in that. That's just how the numbers happen to fall.
Correct. It's mandated. The state gives them a number.
But if that being the case, with there being other things that are not within your purview or your control as a school committeeman, such as the additional things that the mayor and the city council will have to contend with, and that are things such as the landfill cap at $14 million, the sewer reconstruction issue, also the flood wall. We're talking about millions and millions of mandated dollars that the city's been told they have to go ahead and come up with in order to get these programs done without an excuse, but they're not providing any funding for them. Are you looking over your shoulder possibly as to how this might impact you in the school budget? Because the school budget is part of the city budget.
Yeah, I think we're all cognizant of that and the fact that the city might not be able to provide us with funding over the net school minimum that's required. But I think that this school committee has been very fiscally responsible. We've negotiated contracts with all of our school unions that included healthcare reform that will be, in all cases, at the very least, cost neutral, but over those years we'll actually be saving the school district money. So if there is cutbacks for some reason or extra funding not being able to provide it by the city, due to those contracts that we negotiated, I think we can offset it with the savings that we're going to be seeing over the next couple of years with those contracts.
When we talk about the school committee and the function that they are supposed to have, basically they oversee, you hire and fire the superintendent, if you'd like, being direct about it, and you also have the budget that you go ahead and deal with. Those are the 2 main issues that you're dealing with right there, if I'm not mistaken.
And policy.
And being able to establish policy. But are there times that you feel, whether you particularly or in retrospect, generally the school committee as a whole, do you think that in some cases you may have overstepped some of those boundaries and guidelines? And I ask that question only because in past years, there have been reports, news reports and such, that have suggested that the school committee in the city of Haverhill has a tendency to want to be micromanaging and has sometimes, not always, but sometimes dysfunctional aspects about them, about being able to get along.
Well, as far as those reports, I think that you won't see any of those reports in the last probably 1.5 to 2 years. There's been a change, and I think the residents of Haverhill realize that this school committee is focused on educational needs and working well with the superintendent. There were times under prior leaders where the school committee had to step up and almost pick up some slack on some issues that were faltering in the district. But this hasn't.
What were some of those?
There seemed to be a lack of leadership coming from the top and accountability coming from the top, and some people were kind of running on their own platform because there was no accountability. There was no center of accountability.
Could you give us an example of that?
I think that we had, without naming specific names, but we had some principals that were operating on their own island to some degree, and they needed to be reeled back in. And the superintendent at the time, who did a good job, had a different leadership style. He had a very laid-back leadership style, and in some cases that ended up causing some problems, and some people would take advantage of that. The new superintendent, Mr. Scully, is not like that. He's got his thumb on just about everything that goes on in the school district, and oversees it all. So there's been some change, and I think that you see the reason that you don't see in the past year and a half. I can't think of one story that's saying that the school committee's had any issues in getting along. And if you look at the meetings, I think they're cordial, I think they're cooperative, and I think that the committee is working well. I can't think of one thing that Superintendent Scully's asked us to do that we've told him no.
Okay. Can you tell us, we're past the halfway point in our discussion right now, but can you tell us what may be the biggest challenges that you're going to be facing, or that the school system is going to be facing, that the school committee is going to have to try to deal with and remedy somehow in the next year or so?
The biggest problems, obviously, that you're going to still continue to face is for budgetary purposes. We're going to, the city, because of some of the things you mentioned earlier, may not have the ability to help out in an extra capacity. And both the state and federal governments have their own problems with being able to provide funding. Federal governments had to cut back on a lot of the grants that we receive because of their own deficit problems at the federal level. So the committee is going to have to continue to be fiscally responsible and make tough decisions in order to keep moving student achievement forward.
You know, when you take a look at the scores that have recently come out, and there needs to be improvement in some scores, those scores, the scores were up in previous years, and they've been down recently. So that one of the previous candidates talked about the advent of being able to do a drill down theory to find out what some of these issues happen to be, and how some of the subgroups may be testing and how they're affecting the overall score. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that, and do you think that's the focus that people should be taking, or is there any other aspect that should be taken into account in addressing this type of a manner?
Yeah, I do agree with the superintendent has talked about his drill down philosophy. The scores as a whole were a mixed bag. Haverhill High School, Constantino Middle School, and Bradford Elementary are at its highest levels ever with MCAS scores. More students are scoring, passing the test and scoring higher on the exam than ever before. But you do have a couple pockets in the city where the schools need some improvements. And there could be a variety of reasons for that. And the superintendent has gone through and he's going classroom by classroom, teacher by teacher, looking at those scores over the past couple of years to see where the trends are. And I think that's what you need to do. Some of these schools have some, whether it's a higher special education population, a higher low-income population, etc. But that can't be excused, because those kids can learn just like anyone else can, and we can't use that as an excuse.
So when you take a look at the overall picture, this is something that they're doing of a methodical nature just to find out what the story is, taking into account why this would be the case, because if the scores were testing higher immediately in previous years, then what caused that to skew themselves downward?
Correct. And there are some schools that are still continuing to rise. So the question is, why are those schools continuing to rise? Why are those schools at their highest levels, but some schools are declining?
Very good. Scott Wood, we appreciate your being able to be here. We wish you the best of luck in the upcoming election and as an incumbent candidate for school committee.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.